All right, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2021 K-State Garden Hour Winter Series. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you are a regular, welcome back. And we are so happy to have you joining us again. This webinar series began in spring of 2020 as a hope to share extension gardening education during the height of the pandemic. With much success, we've reached over 10,000 garden enthusiasts just like you. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Research and Extension. My name is Lauren Walls, and I am the horticulturist for the Cottonwood Extension District in Central Kansas. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or some related discipline. But most of all, we each have a love of educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started, we do have a couple of quick housekeeping notes to cover. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature related to the presentation. So this is where we will look for questions in the Q&A session. You should see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Just click on that and you will be able to enter your question in that way. Our moderators today are Dennis and Ariel, and they will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation. They will also help us to facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share links through the chat, you will also find those on the website. Our website is also where you will have access to previous topics and upcoming topics. And speaking of, I want to mention that when we begin our 2022 series, you will need to re-register in order to have access to those webinars. Our moderators will send the link for our K-State Garden Hour website over the chat. Today's topic is winter interest in the landscape, and I'm pleased to announce our speaker, Lynn Loughary. She is the horticulturist in Wyandotte County and has been a horticulturist for 18 years. Please give us a few moments while we transition and share the presentation slides.
Good afternoon. I'm sure glad to have everybody on board, and I hope today we can learn about some plant materials that you might consider to put in your landscape. I'm out of Kansas City, Kansas, and we have been devastated by the emerald ash borer, and we have lost just alone at the Legend shopping area 800 ash trees to emerald ash borer. So that means we have a lot of opportunities to add new and interesting plants into the landscape. And our winters can be really drab. And that's why we go all out at Christmas time, decorating our homes with lights and putting out Christmas motifs so that, you know, when we drive down the roads at the end of the day and it's dark and dreary, we have something to pep us up and get us excited about our long winter and the holidays. So I'm going to talk about almost 40 different plants that we can add into our landscapes that will give us some winter interest. So I'm going to darken myself so that I have good bandwidth. So bear with me a minute. Hopefully you can see my slides. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for taking the poll. And I noticed that movement wasn't so high on the list. And I hope after this presentation, you may want to add movement as something that is available and provided by plants. Mainly our ornamental grasses. They are really quite pretty in the winter months, and with the winds in Kansas, we get a lot of movement of the seed heads and the foliage from those plants. So thank you for taking the poll, and I'm going to talk a lot about fascinating plant features for the different plants, in addition to plants that add color and texture and movement, and of course, food for wildlife. I think all of you are trying to provide food for wildlife, and that's a great thing. These plants can also provide cover for wildlife, which is also extremely important. So some of the fascinating features that we're going to talk about are peeling bark, twisty branching, berries, flowing seed heads. And then we're going to talk about a couple of plants that bloom really early in the spring, or what I consider winter time, that bring eternal hope for spring. So let's get started. I'm going to move fairly quickly because we only have a limited amount of time. So the first plant that I think is highly undervalued in the landscape is paperbark maple. This plant I have growing in my own landscape. It's a small tree, 20 to 30 feet tall. It can be a single stem or multi-stemmed, but what I love it for is this peeling, exfoliating bark. It's pretty year round, but in the wintertime, it's exceptionally pretty, especially when we get some snowfall. It also has a very unique trifoliate leaf with excellent fall color. Mine is just now starting to change. It's a bright orange that turns to kind of a maroon color. It also has your typical maple samaras that are quite interesting as well during the winter months. This plant will take sun to part shade. One thing I will tell you is I do keep this well watered in the dry periods of summer because it's pretty intolerant to drought. So if you have a droughty condition in high winds, then this may not be the plant for you. If you do have it in those conditions, you might need to give it some supplemental irrigation. And this is the size of the tree at my house. It's about 18 years old, and this is the fall color. So it's a striking plant for the landscape. The next one that has peeling bark is our river birch, and most of us are familiar with this one. A lot of people want to grow the white birch, and the white birch really is not adapted to this area. It's more for the northern climates, but the river birch is actually native along streams in Missouri and parts of Kansas. It is resistant to birch borer, which is a plus, where most of the white birches are attacked by the birch borer, mainly because they're stressed and don't really fit well here. This is a medium-sized tree, can get 30 to 70 feet tall. This was a plant that we had in our demonstration gardens when we had the old county annex, and it was a striking addition to that landscape. Another one to consider is the seven sunflower, and this is a striking tree, summer, fall, and winter, and it's mainly known for these pink sepals that truly aren't flowers. This is the flower that typically is in late summer. Some people would consider this to be a small to medium tree, but in the winter time, you have these long strips of peeling dark gray, brown bark that strips down, revealing the underneath. So it's a striking tree. It has a unique form and would be a great addition to the landscape. Now, if you have a large yard, then this might be a consideration. This is the London plane tree. It's a large tree. This one's on K-State's campus. And again, it's got striking bark. And we do get calls from time to time where people will call and say, hey, my tree's dying because it's dropping its bark. But several of the trees that we've already talked about, that's the main reason you grow them. And so you have to just reassure people, no, that's been bred to do that. And that's the fascinating characteristic of the tree. The London plane tree, one thing I do want to talk about it is commonly people think that this one is resistant to anthracnose. We typically get a foliage disease, anthracnose, in wet springs. And all the research I looked up about London plane tree is the resistance is highly variable. And so don't assume because you choose the London plane tree that it'll be more resistant to anthracnose. There are a couple varieties, Columbia and Liberty, which seem to fare better with that resistance. But again, it's not 100% proof. Another peeling bark tree is the lace bark elm. These are small to medium-sized trees They are known for their mottled bark. It can be exfoliating like you see in the lower right. It's really an attractive trunk. It is resistant to Dutch elm disease, and it has the flat wing samara, which is in the lower left-hand corner. And these come on in the fall. Most of our elms produce these samaras in the spring, but your lace bark elm, you're going to see those in the fall. I have not seen the lace bark elm pop up seedlings all over like some of the other elms. Can't say that for sure, but where I've seen it, I've not had issues with seedlings. Now we're going to move to stems. There are several plants that we grow for their colorful stems or contorted stems. And so the first one that comes to mind is the dogwoods. And the dogwoods are known for their leaves with these veins going from the main vein all the way to the tips of the leaves. And that's a distinguishing characteristic for the dogwoods. The one that most people are familiar with is the red osier dogwood with the red or maroon stems. Now, the key to keeping the dogwoods having beautiful stems is you really need to prune out the older stems. The most vibrant colors are on the younger stems. So you do need to do some pruning if you want really vibrant colored stems. There are a couple different varieties that I'm familiar with. One is the Asante, which has beautiful red stems. It gets to be about 4 to 5 foot tall. And then there's the silver and gold variety that has yellow stems in the lower right. And the foliage is variegated green with white edges. And it's a little bit bigger than the other. The dogwoods prefer moist soils. They will take full sun to part shade, but again, pruning is a must if you really want to have one that's fairly new is called Midwinter Fire, and that's the one over here on the right. It gets about 5 foot tall, and it has yellow stems tipped with red. Now, I will be honest, I have tried lots of these dogwood shrubs, and I have very heavy clay soils, and I water the back of my beds minimally. And I do not have very good luck with a lot of these newer varieties. And I think it's because they go into winter too dry. So if you're going to grow these plants, then I would put them in an area where you can keep the soil fairly moist, and hopefully they'll last a lot longer in your landscape. Another one that's really unique, not so much pretty in the summer months, but it's the winter. And this is Harry Lauder's walking stick. And it's actually named for a Scottish comedian whose trademark was a crooked walking stick. The other thing that's cool about it is it has these long catkins that hang down most of the winter. Now, the thing you got to be careful here, a lot of these are grafted on different rootstocks, and you will sometimes get suckers develop from the roots. You need to remove those suckers because they will not be contorted. So that's one thing you do have to do. If this will take sun or part shade, it gets fairly large. So a lot of people think it's a cute little plant, and then it gets 9 foot tall, and then they don't know what to do with it. So again, really unique, prettier to me in the winter than in the summer months. Another one to think about is the corkscrew willow. There's a variety called tortuosa, which is also called dragon's claw willow. And this is really a tree, gets 20 to 30 feet tall. And you'll see these in a lot of winter arrangements, especially people will put these in winter containers around the Christmas and other holidays. It's fast growing, like most willows. It thrives in wet areas like most willows. And it's really intriguing. Now we're going to shift to evergreens. This is kind of a no-brainer, but a lot of times we don't think about the evergreens and the foliage that it brings to our birds' cover. And so one that's really popular are the boxwoods. I'm not a big fan of boxwoods, and I know a lot of people are, so I've included them in this presentation. One that I hear quite a bit about is green gem, which is about a 3 to 4 foot globe-shaped plant and has good winter hardiness. A lot of people buy boxwoods and then they prune, and that's what we've done over here to make these more formal type hedges. This is the reason I don't particularly care for boxwoods. In extreme winters, they will get desiccation of the foliage, the evergreen foliage, and you'll get this tan to brown bronzing. And sometimes they will recover and sometimes they won't. And then about the only thing you can do is prune out this damaged foliage. Moving on to what I think is a better selection would be inkberry. Inkberry looks a lot like boxwoods, but it has this really great black berry on it that's very attractive to birds. This will take sun to part shade. It will tolerate damp sites. I've seen it growing in fairly dry conditions as well. So I think once you get it established, then it will be more tolerant to drier conditions. There are male and female plants. So a lot of times we get calls about they bought a plant, it was supposed to have berries and it didn't. So what's wrong? And sometimes you need cross-pollination with a different variety or a female or a male, and that's where we have issues. That's true of a lot of our hollies. So you'll need to make sure that you get both a male and female plant so that you have these glorious berries. There's some more hollies that fit into this category. This is the one that looks more like our Christmas evergreen. And this is basically the same situation as the other. You need a boy and a girl plant. They need to be somewhat close to one another for cross-pollination. This happens to be one at my house. And when I purchased it at a nursery in Topeka. And they had actually potted up a male and a female in the same pot. And when I did some research on it, it was actually China boy and China girl plants. Now, the downside to that is when I planted them in the landscape, then I had basically two plants in one spot and crowding became a huge issue. And in the case of my situation, the boy outgrew the girl. So I have very, very, very few berries. So you may want to keep that in mind and talk to the nursery that you're buying the plants from. But again, they have beautiful, small, pinkish white blooms midsummer and then glorious berries that birds love in the winter months. When we talked about texture, this is where you get your texture. These happen to be yews behind here. And this is your holly in front with the berries. And this is what I mean by texture. You get not only the color and the texture, but you also get the berries, the food for the wildlife. But remember, these are evergreen. So they do lose moisture throughout the winter months. And so when we get into our Indian summer type winter, 70-degree days, drag out the water hose and give these guys some water if it's been extremely dry. If we have adequate ice and rain and snow in the winter months, then you don't need to do that. Some other plants that provide good evergreen foliage are juniperous species. And we have everything from very prostrate, low growing, like blue chip juniper up here in the upper right, to more, they're still compact, but they get fairly large. And again, the main thing people do with the junipers is they plant them too close to foundations, and as they don't realize how big they do get. This Gold Coast juniper on the bottom can get 3 to 4 foot tall and get probably 6 to 8 foot wide. So again, keep that in mind as you plant these. Junipers are great because they're very tolerant of dry conditions. They're deer tolerant. Sorry, can't get my tongue out. Bagworms can be a real problem with the juniper. So you really got to keep an eye on those and either keep those picked off or use sprays to keep them from annihilating your junipers. The one I prefer to plant is a Canardi juniper. And what's intriguing about this is it almost has arms. And these plants really stand out in the landscape. They're great for screenings, whether you're trying to hide trash cans or compost bins. This is a great tree that's very drought tolerant. And again, females are going to have the blueberries. There are both male and female plants. And so depending on what you're wanting to attract, if you want to attract wildlife, then you want to get the female. Norway spruce. A lot of times you will see these in our cemeteries. These trees have done well, particularly in northeast Kansas, and they can be rather large. So you have to give them room to grow. There are a couple of varieties, Acrocana, which has these great, very attractive, almost show-stopping purple young cones in early spring. Now, these don't stay purple. They turn tan like the other cones during the summertime. This will get 10 to 20 feet tall. There's also a weeping Norway spruce that does not get very tall, but it tends to run the branches along the ground. So again, you've got to give this guy some space because he's going to take off. A lot of people love the blue spruces. Now let me remind you that the only native evergreen in Kansas is the junipers. The pines, the spruce, they are not native to Kansas. So therefore they suffer here. They're always under stress. They don't like our extreme winters where we have cold, then warm, then cold, then warm, and we have high winds. So these plants struggle in Kansas, but they can be grown. One of the blue spruce varieties that does really well is Fat Albert. It gets about 10 to 15 foot. It's very broad, so again, you have to give it lots of space. Eastern white pine, again, you will see lots of these in the landscape. This is another plant that gives movement as well as texture. It's got fine, hairy needles, very long, beautiful cones that are kind of tipped in white. They almost look like they have snow on them. But again, this is a rather large tree and is not native to Kansas. Now let's talk about those flowering plants that I said give you hope for spring. And witch hazel comes to mind. This is probably the earliest flowering plant that we have in our landscapes. It can be a shrub or small tree. They bloom somewhere in February through April, depending on the variety. Some of them have excellent yellow fall color. They prefer part shade and moist soils. Arnold's Promise is one that's touted in the literature as being a favorite. It has really fragrant flowers, but it gets pretty tall, 12 to 15 feet. And these have these spidery looking flowers that really stick out in the winter months. Another one is the Lenten Rose. This is a herbaceous perennial. Unfortunately, if the winters are really harsh, you will get this kind of a gnarly looking foliage. It will dry out and desiccate, but the flowers are beautiful. And again, they're the first bloom in the spring. They do best in part shade to shade, and they don't get very tall. If we could just get breeders breed them so that the flowers are more upright versus drooping. Sometimes to see the full effect of the flower, you need to almost pick it up and tilt it upward to enjoy the beauty. For now, we're going to shift to berries. So one that's really fond of us staters is the beauty berry. It has this glorious purple berries right now. The plant itself is that attractive during the summer months. The foliage is kind of boring. It does have these arching branches, but the berries are spectacular. So it's worth putting up with boring to get to this beautiful purple berries. And there are numerous varieties of this genus. I get a lot of calls on people wanting to grow bittersweet in their landscapes. And the number one downfall is finding a supplier of male and female plants. Again, you need a male and you need a female cross-pollinate to have these berries. There is a variety called Autumn Revolution, which has male and female flowers on the same plant. So that's the one you want to seek out. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is a very vigorous vine. It can get 20 to 30 feet long, and it will require support. Most of the time when we see these, we see them in the wild growing up trees. So again, you need a male and female cultivar. Berries. Cotoneaster is one of the better ones for berries on all forms of this plant. It's a real cool plant. I grew it at my house. This is a picture of it in the winter. So the form of it in the winter is beautiful. These berries in the winter, again, are quite striking. The birds just love it. And there's all kinds of sizes and shapes of cotoneaster. Moving on to deciduous holly, this is the one that was in my introductory slide. This is winterberry. And again, it's about 3 to 8 foot tall shrub, so you need to give it room. It has both male and female plants. And the couple of varieties that I have used are Jim Dandy, which is male, and Red Sprite, which is female. And again, these are deciduous, so that means that the leaves will drop, and then you'll be left with the berries on the plant in the winter months. Can take sun to part shade. I've seen it do best in full sun. And let's not forget about crab apples. There are lots and lots of crab apples to choose from. You can get pink ones, you can get white flowering ones, you can get red flowering ones. Not really red, but they're just glorious different colors. You can also get red berries, you can get yellow berries. Some of the cultivars that I like, Prairie Fire, which have red flowers, they're more of a magenta, not so much red. Sargent is white, Royal Raindrops, Candied Apple, different colors, light pink, pinkish red, white, red, you name it, you've got it. And again, this is a picture from the 2007 freeze, but even in winter where you have ice that can be quite devastating, it can also be beautiful, especially when it's covering our berries and our branches. You just hope we don't have limb damage. Another old standby, you see these at a lot of farmsteads, is pyracantha. There is a variety called Cazon, and I'm probably saying that wrong, that gets about 8 to 10 foot tall. So again, rather large shrub. The downside is prickly thorns. It is semi-evergreen to evergreen and will tolerate sun to part shade. And then if you want something more on the native line, you've got your snowberry, coralberry, or buckthrush. And the thing gave this presentation to a group of horticulturists, and they pointed out that the snowberry clearwing moth caterpillar feeds on snowberry and coralberry. So that's a good reason to have it in the landscape as well as the attractive berries. And this is your clearwing moth that you would look for. This is the larva that feeds on the plant. Now we're going to shift to the viburnums. Viburnums, there are numerous viburnums. So I'm just going to pull out a few of the ones that I find attractive. Cardinal Candy is one that I think has really unique berries. It's a rather large shrub, can get up to 6 foot tall, like sun or part shade, and has excellent red to burgundy fall color. And again, a lot of these plants are also outstanding in the summer months with their blooms. Another one is brandywine. Brandywine has this beautiful red and then purple berries. at the same time. So it's very sticky. And then Winterthur is another one that was actually developed in Pennsylvania at the Winterthur Museum. That's what it's named for. And it's a great selection. Some of you may think of this viburnum is known as possum haw or smooth witherrod. That would be the parent plant. But they have developed different cultivars that are just outstanding. Another viburnum is cranberry bush. I have this one growing at my house. I didn't realize it would get quite as large as it does. Mine is over 10 to 12 feet tall. I have renovated this shrub, meaning I've taken it back to about 2 foot tall in late March, and it did fine. It had outgrown its space because I didn't anticipate that 12-foot height, and so it handled renovation quite well. It has white lace cap flowers that are quite attractive in the summer, and the berries, of course. Now, I did find out that there is a compact variety called compactum, and should have done a little research before I bought it. Would have been a better selection for the area I'm growing mine in. Hydrangeas, there's lots and lots of hydrangeas. Oak leaf is the one I'm partial to. This is the one growing at my house. It has really attractive flower heads when dried. They're pretty enough in the summer months, but I really prefer them in the winter. These can be cut. I have brought them inside and put them in vases, and they hold up really well. What I also like about this is the foliage in the fall is just outstanding. It's purples, yellows, golds, maroons, just quite an attractive plant. But again, you need to give it plenty of room to grow. And these sometimes will send up suckers as well. There's some others. This is from the Johnson County Demonstration Gardens. There's the PG hydrangea tree. So that's kind of unique in the winter months, gives a lot of texture. You can see the evergreens in the background. Then you've got the paniculata types, and there are several of those. Now, the thing you want to keep in mind about some of these large flowering seed heads, they tend to flop. So instead of staying upright, they're so heavy that they tend to arch down to the ground and what I call flop. So you might want to consider smaller varieties where they're trying to reduce that characteristic on the plants. Now, when we talked about movement early on, your grasses, your ornamental grasses are going to give you that characteristic throughout the winter months. A lot of people tend to cut down their ornamental grasses this time of the year, and I say no, leave them. I have a lot of birds that eat the seeds off of my seed heads all winter long, and I love the movement that they provide at the back of my landscape. They're also very attractive when we get ice accumulation on them or heavy frost in the mornings. So there are all kinds. There are reedgrass, silvergrass, fountain grasses, switchgrass. There's all kinds of varieties. There's some of your more natives, like your blue stems. Your blue stems tend to flop in the landscape. They are used to other grass competition. So you may have an issue with flopping on some of these grasses. The other thing to keep in mind about grasses, they're extremely high maintenance. They do require dividing every 3 to 5 years. If you don't, then the centers die out. So just want to be upfront with people that ornamental grasses do require cutting back in the spring, and they do require divisions, but they give you a lot of movement in the garden. They give you texture, they give you different heights, and in the summer months, they have different foliage color, whether it be banded or stripes, and then all kinds of textures, widths. So the ornamental grasses are great to add to the landscape, but don't be fooled. They are quite high maintenance. And so here's some pictures. This is your little blue stem over here. And this is some of the grasses at my house with some frost and ice and snow on them. Here is Kaufman Gardens. I love to go there year round, and they do a fine job of interplanting evergreens with the ornamental grasses. You also want to note here that a lot of our trees, just the form of them, bring a lot of interest to our gardens in the winter time. Some other things to consider would be our redbuds. They have the seed pods. They're a legume, so they have those flat seed pods like up here. Then you also have wisteria, and they have more of a fuzzy legume type seed pod. But these can be very, very aggressive, and they require a very strong support system. They will eat up a wood arbor. So you almost need something made out of metal to contain these. The other thing we have down here in the bottom right is Nandina. And I was reminded during a presentation that these berries contain cyanide and they can be deadly. So buyer beware. Just want to throw that out there so there's no misconception about that. Perennials. I try to encourage people to leave the seed heads, to leave the debris throughout the winter. Yes, it looks untidy, but the main reason for that is these seed heads provide great food for our feathered friends. Not only that, but a lot of these stems will be hollow, and a lot of our pollinators will have their cocoons or their pupa in those stems. So I try to encourage people to leave that, and if they have to, put up a little sign that says, hey, you know, I'm leaving this stuff so that birds and the pollinators can overwinter. And then a lot of these perennials will have almost evergreen foliage. This is a heuchera that I have at my house that until we get down into the minus degrees, this will be almost evergreen throughout the winter. You can see we've got snow here, and this one happens to be dark green on top with a purple undertone. And unfortunately, I cannot remember the name of this, and I've tried to find it, but it's out of my vocabulary right now. I cannot remember the name. The other thing is the arums. They will have semi-evergreen foliage, and they will poke up through leaf litter and the snow as well. And also vinca vine is a great one. That's kind of evergreen type foliage that will give you texture and some color in the winter months. Here's a couple landscapes that I've taken to show you what I mean by winter interest. So over here on the left, we have mugo pines giving you great green foliage. We've got some miscanthus with the pretty seed heads and the movement that it gives. And then this is a locust tree that has great structure and form in winter months. Across to the right, we have a red twig dogwood. We have more ornamental grasses, and we have some more evergreens. And I love the use of rock. Rock is also, don't forget about your hardscapes and your rocks and stuff, because they're very attractive in the winter months, more so than even in the summer. So here's some other pictures where we're using junipers and yews to give the evergreen effect. The beautyberry here, you can see some of the purple berries still hanging on. And of course, crab apples with their berries as well. And I'm a big proponent of yard art, and so don't forget about those adding winter interest as well. You can see down here, we've got an old wagon wheel. So it doesn't just have to be plant materials. Here's some more yard art. Here's a dry riverbed with the rocks. Again, these things all add up to giving beautiful winter interest to your landscapes. And if you don't have an area to plant plants, you're maybe living in an apartment and you have a balcony or an entryway, then you might want to consider coming up with year-round containers. You can use evergreens from the garden. You can use the contorted twigs. You can use the white birch. Unfortunately, this is where most white birches end up. They end up cut up as either firewood or containers. So you've got a use for those when they don't pan out in the landscape. Don't forget, a lot of our plants, evergreens, have cones, and those are really striking, not only in containers, but on the plants themselves. So with that, I think I've covered quite a few plants. Are there any questions that I can entertain?
Hang on a second, Lynn. Yes, Lynn, your presentation kept us, Ariel and I, busy answering questions. So I'm going to just cherry pick a few that I think might be of more interest to individuals. So, and some of these get back to, I know this presentation is more about plant selection, not plant care. So one of the questions that came in was on the red twig, yellow twig dogwood. Can you cover how to prune those so they retain their color? Because you know, if you don't prune, they go gray.
Okay, so what I mean by pruning is where you're going to find the stems that are drab, and you're going to go all the way back to the ground with those and clip those at the ground. And then that will encourage new twigs next spring. And you'll just keep doing that. You're not going to remove a lot of twigs. You're probably going to remove maybe 4, 5, 6, depending on if you've done this from the beginning. Now, if you have a dogwood that you haven't touched for years, then I would not take any more than probably 25% of the twigs out at any one time.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of an ongoing rejuvenation pruning because it
Correct.
suckers back. So questions about, so all these plants are winter interest, so people are gravitating to them now, but they can't find them in nurseries, garden centers. Or when's a good time to shop for these? And then can you plant into the fall? How late?
You know, the way I look at it is this: you can plant a container grown tree, shrub, anytime the ground is not frozen. Now, I prefer to plant earlier in the fall than say now, because I want them to get good root growth going into the winter, because we never know if we're going to have a harsh winter or a mild winter. But I also have people call that say they went to a nursery, bought it still in the container. Number one, it's better to plant it now, get it in the ground, get it watered, get it established. Remember, our soils are still really warm, so they're going to get good root growth right now, but they may need supplemental water going into winter. I agree. Now is not a good time to try to find a lot of these plants because the nurseries don't want to maintain them throughout the winter. So spring is when you'll probably have the best luck in finding these plants. And I would shop around. I tend to buy local. I don't tend to do mail order anything because I want to support our local industry. And I want to buy from nurseries that buy their plant material within 100 to 150 mile radius. Those do better in our area. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay. Yeah, so a little bit more about ornamental grass care. So your recommendation was not to cut them back in the fall to get the winter interest. So when would you recommend dividing those and cutting them back?
What I recommend and what I've had luck with, I had 18 ornamental grasses at the back of my property. I wanted to do a living fence, and I quickly found I couldn't handle all the debris in the spring because I cut mine back in March. I'll find a warm day, and I've actually bought a weed eater with a blade on it, and that's what I use. And I cut it back to about 3 inches above the ground, and I bundle all that debris up. And then I have a master gardener with a heavy duty shredder, and we shred all of that and then place it back into my garden as mulch. So I would also recommend that when you do that step, that's when you get out the axe, because that's about what it takes to divide these plants, especially if they're 5 years or older. If you don't do that, then they get that dead center, and then you'll get, foliage in a ring and the whole center will be dead. So I would divide them every 3 to 5 years. You don't want to wait until the clump is so big that you can't manage it.
You know, Lynn, I may ad lib on here if you don't mind, because our demonstration gardener, master gardeners have here at our office, we have a number of ornamental grasses. And we've made several decisions. First of all, they're very large, really big grasses. We've decided not to plant them anymore because many of them are miscanthus, which are not native species, that some can reseed. And you're right, on our philosophy is they get much bigger than a dinner plate, platter size. We cut them back, divide them into thirds or fourths and go back to more of a saucer size, which you're right, that's about every 3 to 5, because once they become this huge, it's a jackhammer to get them out. It's an axe. And we've decided that many of them are not worth the effort for that season. We've gone to more of the native grasses or ones that are slower clumpers. And it really makes our volunteers happy not to have to deal with those overgrown grasses. Okay, next question is back to hellebores. Can you go a little bit more into detail about their care and culture and how to, when to deadhead them, when to prune them, when to clean them up, those type of things?
Okay, I'll be honest, we have these in our demonstration garden at the Ag Hall of Fame, and it's probably the most brutal location for a demonstration garden. It's wide open to the wind. The care out there is minimal during the winter. So we basically leave our debris. We have quite a bit of leaf litter from a big oak tree. So they're somewhat protected from the leaf litter. They don't get near the desiccation of the foliage as in a more open area. So our care is minimal. We cut them back, meaning just the flower stalks once the flower stalks have died down. But other than that, we don't do a lot of maintenance. We do remove those leaves around them, come about March, the end of March.
Okay, hang on, I'm answering another question about what do you do with overgrown grasses? And basically what I'm telling the person is take an axe to them, take a power tool to them, reciprocating saw, and basically just chop the living HE double hockey sticks out of them. And all you need if you want to replant them is just one small piece. You don't have to plant them all back. So yeah, sometimes you gotta go ahead.
I will say this. If you're in an area where you can burn, the best way to remove that dead debris is to burn them. Now, I can't do that because I live in the city limits and I have fences all around mine, so I can't do it safely. But I have a lot of friends that have acreage and they wait on a calm day, go to their local fire station, get a permit, and they burn them. They also find that burning them, they don't get near the dead center that I do in mine. I think they're just lucky because I do think that over time that dead center will come as they get bigger and bigger.
Yeah. So a couple questions have come in around unfortunately, many of the plants you showed, because they have colorful berries, fruits, flowers, are sun loving. So the questions have come in several times. Can you pick the 3 or 4 of these winter interest plants that might do some light shade to deep shade?
There's quite a few. I think most of your hollies, your hydrangeas, your viburnums, they will take part shade. So the witch hazels, they'll take part shade. So there's quite a few that will.
The other one that you didn't mention, I put in the chat box earlier to a person was Caria, because it has green stems, bright yellow flowers. It's kind of a gnarly looking plant, but it's probably one of the better flowering shrubs for really heavy shade.
I think there is a poll, Cheryl, if you're on here. I want to ask the people on the Zoom if they have other plants like you're recommending, Dennis, that I need to add to this slide set, because this is always, something that's intriguing to me and I want to continually build. So if you do have plants that you have in your landscape or experience with, please either put them in the chat or let me know.
The other question that came up a little bit, and this is probably a whole nother presentation, but the vast majority of the plants you recommended would be considered exotic. So not for sure if your forte is any native plants that would fill the bill for some winter interest?
Well, the main one, native one that I talked about was the snowberry or the buckbrush. Those are the natives that I mainly talked about. But anytime you get into, what I found, any kind of fascinating features, a lot of that has been bred into these newer cultivars. So again, I'd be very open to that. But like your river birch, that's supposedly a native. So, it's got that intriguing exfoliating bark. So yeah, if people have ideas, drop them in the chat for me.
Another pruning question, kind of back to boxwood and the junipers. When's the best time to prune those that control size?
Ooh, that's a good question. Now, first off, I want to say that particularly for junipers, you've got to be real cautious how far back you prune those, because once you get into that brown stems with no foliage, those aren't going to regenerate foliage. So you've got to be real selective in how you prune those. Once you get into that dead zone, you're going to have a really ugly shrub, and you're probably going to have to cut it to the base and get rid of it and replant. I would wait until March, when you know what kind of damage you have as far as the boxwoods. That's the only reason I would really want to eliminate that dead growth, would be in the spring. Now, if you're just pruning for shape or for size, I always want to remind people, when you buy a plant, buy the size you need, so you don't have to prune. If you're a formal landscape and have to prune because you like that look, then I would say you could do it several times during the summer months. The thing you don't want to do, that I see people do, is they always cut it back to the same exact spot every time. You've got to let it grow a little bit. And then, don't just keep cutting it to the same point all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I will tell you, Lynn, you created quite a little stir in the chat box over your recommendation of rock. And maybe were you thinking about, I think maybe with the example you gave, I think you implied that rock as a mulch is
not
recommended. But I think what you were trying to say is rocks as an accent feature that create year-round interest. Is that
Absolutely. Matter of fact, it's kind of funny you say that, because I will tell people 100% of the time, do not use rock as a mulch under plants. What I like, though, is I like to have a boulder every now to get in my beds, or like you do at your demonstration garden, where you had that dry stream bed look. I think that's really attractive. But no, I don't recommend using rock for a mulch.
Well, I guess, Lynn, you and I work together enough. I knew that's not what you meant, but when the comments started to come in that you were recommending using landscape rock, it's like, oh, that's really not Lynn. Yeah. So yeah, rocks can add that interest. And one of my favorite questions in the chat box came in is, where do you find decent yard art? And my comment was, what's your definition of decent?
Yeah.
So,
I tend to go for rusty yard art, which a lot of people don't like. So I can find that just about any place. There's a great shop up in Weston that I get a lot of my stuff from. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's kind of back to, and it's your taste of what you like, those type of things. So someone's following up, I guess, with a question for me. I talked about the grasses versus, getting rid of some of the larger ones, some of the more natives. So we have gravitated to a lot of our native little blue stems. Granted, they're smaller, but they are not aggressive. And of course, you've got the Carl Forster, the cool season grass, which is a non-native. Many of the switch grasses, some are really large, very, very aggressive. Some like Shenandoah, Cheyenne Spirit, or Cheyenne Sky, excuse me. Those are kind of 3-footers. They're not quite as aggressive. So you just kind of have to watch. And then there's some big blue stem varieties out there too, which we've not tried those yet in our garden. And then of course you get into like prairie drop seed, blue grama grass, those type of things also, which would be native grasses.
Yeah, and we're doing the same thing at the Ag Hall of Fame. We have a demonstration garden with our master gardeners, and we have pulled out our miscanthus, and we're doing the same thing. We're looking at different blue stems. We're looking at, anything that won't flop, but yet will tolerate the drier conditions.
Yeah, one of the problems with the native grasses, if you put them in these garden conditions, they too get more robust and can potentially then tend to flop. So yeah, and that was another question about what we got, maybe time for one more. What's your comments on fertilizing the shrubs? Back to a kind of a cultural question.
Okay, so my opinion on fertilizing shrubs is if you fertilize your lawn, they're getting more than adequate amounts of fertilizers. Most of the time, matter of fact, at our demo gardens, we rarely fertilize our shrubs or trees, and the lawn is not even fertilized. So again, I think we over fertilize a lot of times, and then our plant growth becomes unruly. So unless you're seeing chlorotic leaves or foliage that doesn't look as healthy, our soils are naturally high in phosphorus and potassium. So nitrogen would be the only component they may need, and I would do a soil test to determine really what you do need to add if you are going to fertilize.
Okay. I think we're about out of time. You're getting good comments. Either if you maybe someone saves the chat box. You got a lot of suggestions for plants. Unfortunately, a lot of them for summer color, not as many for the fall, winter conditions that you were thinking about. Some that people are putting in here are some of the like the golden mops to give that golden color, which some of the junipers have. Sweet Spire, Itea also is another one for some nice fall purplish color. And maybe you talked about some of these and I was too busy answering questions and missed them. So, okay, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, the close out our session. And Lynn, thank you so much.
Welcome.
All right, well, great job again, Lynn, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about winter interest in landscape with us, and a thank you to Ariel and Dennis as well for answering the questions. Once again, thank you to all of you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are so glad you could be here today to learn about the winter interest in our landscape, and be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website, which will be sent again, the link will in the chat box. And reminder that if you need to, or if you want to watch the 2022 K-State Garden Hour webinar series, you will need to re-register when the time comes for that. This session is recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please, please, please fill this out. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu, which will also be sent over the chat. Thank you again. We hope you continue to tune in to our Garden Hour series, and have a great week.